She walked into the wedding reception wearing a necklace worth a fortune and was kicked out in front of hundreds of people. Her son, the son she had sacrificed her whole life to raise. If this were your story, what would you do? Don't go anywhere, because what happens next will leave you breathless. Subscribe now so you don't miss the most shocking stories on this channel. Like and comment with the name of the city or country you're watching. I want to know how far my story has traveled in the world. I used to believe that family was the one thing in this world that couldn't be faked. I built a company from nothing. I negotiated contracts in boardrooms full of men who thought I was decorative. I survived a recession that swallowed whole industries whole. I buried my husband. I raised a son on my own after that, in a house that suddenly felt too large and too quiet, with grief sitting in every room like furniture nobody had bothered to move. And through all of it, every sleepless night, every hard decision, every year I gave to building something that would outlast me, I held on to one belief: that the people who shared my name, my blood, my history, would be the ones I could trust without question. I was 72 years old the night I found out how completely, devastatingly wrong I was. The event was my granddaughter Lillian's wedding reception. A Friday evening in late October at the Hargrove Grand Ballroom in downtown Chicago, which I had visited exactly once before, for a charity fundraiser 6 years prior. I remembered thinking it was too much marble, too many crystal chandeliers, too many mirrors catching your reflection from angles you hadn't asked for. The kind of place designed to make you feel small unless you were the one paying for it. That night, Nathan was the one paying for it. My son, Nathan Whitmore, 51 years old, president of Whitmore International Holdings. A title that existed because I had chosen, at 63, to step back from day-to-day operations and let him lead. I believed in him then. I want to be honest about that. I am not the kind of woman who pretends she never made a mistake. I believed in my son, and I handed him something I had spent 40 years constructing with my own hands, and I told him to carry it forward. What I did not know, what I would not learn until later, was that by the time Lillian's wedding invitations went out, Nathan had already made his decision about what to do with me. I arrived at the Hargrove at 7:15. I had taken a car service because my driving at night had become something I didn't fully trust anymore, and I wasn't too proud to admit that. I wore the navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. Not flashy, but tailored, the kind of thing a woman wears when she wants to look composed rather than desperate for attention. Around my neck, I wore Margaret's necklace. That's what I called it. Margaret's necklace. It had belonged to my late husband Richard's mother, a thin gold chain with a pendant of 3 interlocking diamonds that caught light in a way that felt almost alive. Richard had given it to me on our 30th anniversary, and I had worn it on every occasion that mattered since then. I had decided, driving to the ballroom that night, that I was going to give it to Lillian, that I was going to clasp it around her neck myself and tell her what it meant, what her grandfather had been, what our family had once stood for. I was carrying it in a small velvet pouch in my evening bag. The lobby of the Hargrove was already full of people. Men in dark suits, women in silk and sequins, servers weaving through with trays. The wedding was clearly not the intimate family gathering Nathan had described to me when I'd asked about the guest count 2 months prior. He'd said 200, maybe 220. Looking at the crowd already filling the space at 7:15, I revised that estimate significantly upward. I found the reception table near the entrance to the main ballroom. A young woman with a headset and a clipboard looked up at me with practiced hospitality. "Name?" she asked. "Evelyn Whitmore," I said. "The groom's grandmother." She scrolled. I watched her face carefully, the way you learn to watch faces after a lifetime in business, and I saw it. A flicker, the smallest hesitation, gone almost before it appeared. "One moment," she said, and reached for her earpiece. I stood there. Around me, couples swept past with the easy confidence of people who knew they were expected. Nobody was looking at me directly, but I have enough experience with rooms to know when I am being noticed peripherally. Something in the air had shifted. "Mrs. Whitmore." I turned. Nathan was standing 6 feet away in a charcoal tuxedo I had never seen before. He looked polished and composed, and entirely unlike the boy who had once cried in my kitchen at 11 years old because a classmate had called him stupid. He had the posture of a man who had spent months rehearsing this exact moment. Behind him, slightly to his left, stood his wife Clara. She was wearing red, a choice that struck me as deliberate, and her expression was the careful blankness of someone actively suppressing something. Satisfaction, I would later decide. She was suppressing satisfaction. "Nathan," I said, "I seem to be having a problem at the desk." "That's because your name isn't on the list," he said. He said it without lowering his voice. He said it with other people nearby, with servers in earshot, with a cluster of well-dressed guests not 8 feet away who had clearly picked up on the energy and slowed their conversation. I looked at my son. I took him in. His pressed tuxedo, his easy stance, the absence of any discomfort whatsoever on his face. And I understood, in the particular way you understand things that have been true for longer than you realized, that this was not an accident. "I beg your pardon?" I said. My voice was steady. I have always been able to keep my voice steady. It's one of the things Richard used to say about me, that I could negotiate through anything without cracking, that my composure was the most unnerving weapon in my professional arsenal. I didn't feel composed, but I sounded it. "Tonight is a private event," Nathan said, "for family and business associates. I think it's best if you head home, Mother. This isn't the night for complications." Complications. He had chosen that word specifically. I knew it instantly. Nathan had always been careful with language when he was trying to maintain control of a situation. It was something he had learned from me, actually, in years of watching me work. And calling me a complication rather than a person, rather than his mother, rather than the grandmother of the bride, was not careless. It was architecture. He was building the frame before anyone else could build it for him. "This is Lillian's wedding," I said, "and Lillian's focus needs to be on her husband and their evening," he said, "not on managing a situation." Clara still hadn't spoken. She was watching me with that measured blankness, and I noticed her hand was resting on Nathan's arm. Not a loving touch, more like the grip of someone steadying a post that might otherwise shift. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think people assume that a woman of my age and experience would feel rage, would feel the hot, immediate response of someone whose dignity has been challenged publicly. What I actually felt was much quieter than that, and much colder. It was the sensation of something clicking into place, the specific, terrible click of a conclusion you had been avoiding because the evidence, while present, had always seemed explainable by something less awful. The forgotten callbacks, the health forms that appeared in my mail that I hadn't requested, the conversations I'd had with Lillian over the past year that had been strangely thin, the way a call sounds when someone else is in the room listening. I looked at my son. I thought about the 40 years I had spent so that he would never have to worry about anything. The sacrifices, the long nights, the deals I had walked away from, and the ones I had stayed in long past the point of comfort. The house I had kept for him after Richard died. The tuition I had paid. The seed money for his first real venture before Whitmore Holdings had been anything worth the name. I thought about Margaret's necklace in the velvet pouch in my bag. And then I did something that I think genuinely surprised Nathan, because it was not what he had braced himself for. I smiled. Not a warm smile. Not a performative one, designed for the audience of nearby guests. A small, private smile, the kind that belongs entirely to the person wearing it, the kind that says, "I see you, and you have just made the most significant mistake of your life." "All right," I said, "I'll leave you to your evening." I turned and walked back through the lobby. I did not look back. I did not pause. I walked at the pace of someone with somewhere to be, past the marble columns and the crystal light fixtures and the servers with their trays, through the revolving glass doors and out into the October night. The air outside was sharp and clean and smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. My car was already gone. I'd dismissed it when I arrived, thinking I'd be inside for hours. I walked to the corner and stood on the sidewalk and pulled my phone from my bag. For a moment I didn't dial anyone. I just stood there, the velvet pouch warm in my palm, the city noise filtering past me, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. My son had looked me in the face and told me I was a complication, in front of witnesses, deliberately, without a flicker of the man I thought I had raised. And in that moment, standing on a wet Chicago sidewalk in a navy dress, at 72 years old, holding a necklace I had intended to give to the granddaughter I was apparently no longer allowed to see, something hardened in me. Not bitterness. Something cleaner than that. Something that felt unexpectedly like clarity. I had spent 60 years building things. I knew what the first night of real work felt like. I knew the particular shift that happens when you stop grieving what's been lost and start deciding what comes next. I found Marcus Hale in my contacts, my attorney of 23 years, a man who had seen me through contracts and crises and the legal reorganization of Whitmore Holdings 3 times over. It was 7:30 on a Friday night. His phone rang twice. "Evelyn," he said, and the tone in his voice already told me he was somewhere quiet. "I need to meet with you," I said. "Monday morning, first thing. And Marcus, I need you to pull everything, every document with my signature on it from the past 18 months, everything." A beat of silence. "What happened?" he said. I watched a cab roll past in the street. 2 people on the opposite sidewalk were laughing at something, leaning into each other, entirely unbothered by anything. "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I'm going to find out." I hung up and stood there a moment longer, the October air pressing against my face. I thought about the way Nathan had looked at me, the practiced ease of it, the absence of guilt or uncertainty, or even the most basic social discomfort. He had been rehearsing that moment. He had stood in some room, maybe his office, maybe at home with Clara, and he had rehearsed the words, the posture, the exit. He had decided in advance exactly how it would go, which meant that whatever was underneath it had been planned for much longer than tonight. I put my phone back in my bag. I felt the velvet pouch one more time with my fingertips. The small, solid weight of it, the history of it, everything it carried. And I made a decision. I was not going to fall apart. I was not going to sit in an apartment and ask myself where I had gone wrong, replaying conversations, looking for the moment that might have changed things if I had noticed it differently. That particular exercise had never helped anyone, and I had never had patience for it. Instead, I flagged down a cab, gave the driver my address, and spent the 15-minute ride home in complete silence, running numbers in my head. Not money, not yet, but people, who I trusted, who I could call. Who, in the architecture of the company I had built, would be loyal to the institution rather than to the man currently running it. The list was longer than Nathan probably thought it was. By the time I reached my front door, I had the beginning of something. Not a plan. Not yet. Not with enough information, but a direction. The first point on a map. I went inside. I made myself a cup of tea, which I didn't drink. I sat in the kitchen with the lights low and Margaret's necklace on the table in front of me. And I thought about my granddaughter, who was somewhere in that ballroom at this very moment dancing at her wedding without knowing why her grandmother wasn't there, or what her father had said, or what any of it meant. I thought about the last time I'd really talked to Lillian. Not a strained 20-minute call, but really talked, the way we used to. It had been more than a year. The conversations had grown short and careful, and I had told myself it was the natural drift of a young woman building her own life, that she was busy, that it wasn't anything to worry about. I had been telling myself a lot of things, it turned out. I set down my cup. I looked at the necklace, and I let myself for exactly 1 minute feel the full force of what it meant that I was sitting here alone instead of standing beside my granddaughter on the most important night of her young life. 1 minute. That's the rule I had made for myself a long time ago, in the first brutal year after Richard died. You get the grief. You don't run from it, you don't talk yourself out of it, you don't skip it. You get 1 minute and you feel it all the way down, and then you get back to work. The minute passed. I picked up my phone again and started making a list. The list I made that night was 2 pages long by the time I finished. Not a list of grievances, not a catalog of hurts, which would have been easy to compile and completely useless. What I wrote down were names. People inside Whitmore Holdings, who had been there before Nathan took the operational reins. People whose loyalty I understood because I had hired them myself, or promoted them, or stood in a room and defended them when someone else wanted them gone. People who, when they thought about the company, thought about what it had been built to be rather than what it could be stripped down and sold for. I also wrote down questions, the kind you ask when you realize the ground has been moving under your feet for longer than you noticed. When exactly had the transfers started? Which accounts? Who had witnessed my signatures on those documents? Because I had signed things in the past year. I knew that. Paperwork that Nathan or Clara had brought to me framed as routine administrative updates, the kind of forms that pile up when a company is restructuring. I had signed them. I hadn't read every line. That was the truth I had to sit with, and it wasn't comfortable. I had trusted my son enough to sign papers he put in front of me without the scrutiny I would have applied to any stranger across a negotiating table. That's what love does to you. It lowers your guard in places you don't even notice until the draft comes through. I slept badly that night, which I expected. What I didn't expect was the dream, or not quite a dream, more the kind of half-conscious rerunning your mind does when it's trying to process something it hasn't finished understanding. I kept seeing Nathan's face at the entrance of the Hargrove, the composed certainty of it. The way his eyes had moved past me slightly, checking the room, as though I were a problem to be managed in front of an audience rather than a person he had any feeling for whatsoever. I had looked at that face for 51 years and thought I knew it. That was the thing I kept returning to in the dark of my bedroom. Not the betrayal itself, but the distance between who I had believed my son to be and who he had apparently become, or perhaps who he had always been underneath the version I needed to see. When you raise a child, you build a story about them. You gather evidence the way you want it to mean something, the kindnesses, the moments of generosity, the times they surprised you. You discount the other things, the small cruelties, the patterns, the way certain behaviors kept appearing in new forms over the years like a song played in different keys. I had discounted a great deal about Nathan. I could see that now, at 72, sitting in my kitchen at 4 a.m. with a cold cup of tea. Monday arrived the way difficult days always do, too quickly and with unremarkable weather. I was dressed and in a cab by 7:15. Marcus's office was on the 43rd floor of a building on Michigan Avenue with a view of the lake that Richard had always said was the best argument for paying Chicago rent prices. I had been in that office more times than I could count. It felt, that morning, like one of the few places in the city where I was fully certain of the ground beneath me. Marcus was already there when I arrived, which told me the call Friday night had registered with the weight I'd intended. I was 64. With the kind of face that had been serious so long it had settled into it permanently. Deep-set eyes, a mouth that didn't do much in the way of social performance, hair that had gone from gray to white sometime in the last few years without either of us having made note of it. He had a conference table covered in folders. I pulled what I could over the weekend, he said, before I'd even sat down. The full picture is going to take more time, but Evelyn, some of what I'm already seeing is not good. Tell me, I said. He opened the first folder. In the past 14 months, there have been 11 wire transfers from the primary operating account of Whitmore Holdings to subsidiary accounts, most of them structured just below the threshold that would trigger automatic review. The authorizations carry your signature. I looked at the pages he slid toward me. My signature, yes. On lines I didn't remember reading carefully, on documents that had been presented to me. I could now reconstruct this clearly. On days when I was tired, or when Nathan had come by the apartment under the premise of a casual visit and produced paperwork almost as an afterthought. Oh, while I'm here, there are a few things that need your approval. Routine restructuring. Shouldn't take 5 minutes. I had given him 5 minutes. 11 times. How much? I said. Marcus looked at me steadily. In total, across the 11 transfers, approximately $4.3 million. The number sat between us on the table. I have negotiated contracts worth 40 times that amount. I have watched markets move in ways that erase that figure in an afternoon. But this was different. This wasn't market movement. This wasn't a calculated risk I had chosen to take. This was money extracted from what I had built through signatures I had provided without understanding what I was signing, by a person who had walked into my home and smiled at me while he did it. Where did it go? I asked. That's still being traced, Marcus said. 2 of the subsidiary accounts appear to be controlled by a holding company registered in Delaware. The registered agent is an entity I don't recognize. I have a forensic accountant starting on it today. He paused. There's something else. He opened a second folder. 3 weeks ago, a petition was filed with the Cook County Probate Court. It's a petition for appointment of a legal guardian for an adult. Specifically, an adult alleged to be experiencing significant cognitive decline. He looked at me. The petitioner is Nathan Whitmore. The subject of the petition is you. The room was very quiet. I had known, somewhere beneath the surface of what I was willing to fully consider, that something like this was possible. The health forms. The visits from a doctor I hadn't requested. A gentle, soft-spoken man named Dr. Ellison, who had come by the apartment twice in the past 8 months at Nathan's arrangement, framed as wellness check-ins, who had asked me questions I now understood were not casual. What day is today? Can you count backward from 100? Do you sometimes feel confused about where you are? I had answered them. I had been patient with it, because I assumed it came from a place of concern. Filial concern. The kind a son might feel for an aging mother. I had been embarrassed, actually, at some of the questions, the way you're embarrassed when someone implies you might need help. But I had answered them, and I had not pushed back, and now I understood that those visits had not been about concern at all. They had been evidence gathering. A guardianship petition, I said. My voice came out completely even. I was very grateful for that. Filed quietly, Marcus said. No hearing date yet. But the petition claims, and I'm reading directly here, that you are experiencing progressive cognitive impairment that renders you unable to manage your financial and personal affairs. It requests that Nathan Whitmore be appointed as your legal guardian with full authority over your assets, medical decisions, and living arrangements. Full authority. Over my assets, my medical decisions, my living arrangements. I sat with that for a moment. My son, the boy I had kept up with through fevers, through heartbreaks, through failures, he never knew I'd quietly helped him recover from, had filed a document with a court describing me as a person no longer capable of determining where she lived or what happened to her body. I was going to put me somewhere, I said. It wasn't a question. It had the tone of something becoming solid, a conclusion assembling itself from parts that had been scattered across too long a time. Not right away, but eventually. Get control of the assets, establish the guardianship. Then, when it was convenient, have me placed in a facility somewhere, out of the way. Marcus didn't answer immediately, which was an answer. It's a possibility we have to consider, he said carefully. I stood up and walked to the window. The lake was flat and gray that morning, the kind of November gray that felt less like weather and more like a statement. I looked at it for a moment, and I thought about Richard, not in a mournful way, but in the practical way I sometimes thought about him when I needed to make a hard decision. What would you do? I thought. Not because I needed permission, but because he had known Nathan too, had loved him too, and would have been sitting with the same impossible reconciliation I was sitting with. How the person you raised and the person currently described in these documents could be the same human being. Then I stopped thinking about Richard, because what I actually needed right now was not sentiment. What I needed was a strategy. I turned back from the window. The petition, I said. What's our window before a hearing is scheduled? Typically 60 to 90 days from filing, Marcus said. Given when it was filed, we're looking at roughly 7 to 10 weeks. Enough time, I said. Enough time to do what exactly? Marcus asked, and the way he said it was careful, not doubting me, but wanting to understand the full shape of what I was thinking before he committed to anything. I sat back down. I folded my hands on the conference table. I thought, for a moment, about the expression on Nathan's face at the Hargrove ballroom, the practiced ease, the certainty that I would go quietly, that I would be confused or frightened or simply too old and too diminished to do anything but comply. Enough time to take everything back, I said. Marcus looked at me. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise, but the particular attention of a man recalibrating his sense of the situation in front of him. Tell me what you know about those subsidiary accounts, I said. Everything. What followed over the next 4 hours was the most thorough and methodically miserable meeting of my professional life, which is saying something considerable given what my professional life had contained. Marcus walked me through everything he had been able to pull: the transfer records, the guardianship petition, the shell structure of the Delaware holding company, which was called Arvine Capital Group, and which had, so far as Marcus's weekend research could determine, no legitimate business operations whatsoever, no public footprint, no verifiable principles. It was a container, built to receive money. And then, because I needed to understand the full scope, Marcus told me about the investors. I had known, in a general way, that Nathan had been in conversations with outside investors over the past year. He had mentioned it, framed as routine, exploring capital partnerships, the language of modern business development, nothing alarming on its face. What I had not known was the specific nature of those conversations, or who the investors were, or what exactly was being offered to them. Marcus had found a term sheet. It had taken some careful extraction from documents Nathan had filed as part of standard regulatory disclosure, but it was there, and what it described was not a capital partnership. It was a sale. Nathan was in advanced discussions to sell a controlling 63% stake in Whitmore International Holdings to a private equity consortium called Meridian Consolidated Partners, a firm with a clear and documented pattern of acquiring family-held businesses, extracting short-term value through aggressive restructuring, and offloading what remained within 3 to 5 years. Whitmore Holdings, in other words, would not survive the transaction intact. What I had built would be disassembled. The people who had worked there for decades, some of them since the early days when we were still operating out of a converted warehouse in Bridgeport, would be collateral. The company's identity, its reputation, its relationships, the specific quality of how it operated that I had spent 40 years cultivating, would be subordinated to a quarterly return calculation made by people who had never met a single one of our clients. "When is the deal scheduled to close?" I asked. "Based on the timeline in the term sheet," Marcus said, 90 days from now, give or take. 90 days, the same window as the guardianship hearing. They were timed together. They had to be. The sale required my incapacitation, because without it, as the founder and still the majority shareholder, I retained the legal authority to block any transaction involving more than a 49% stake transfer. The guardianship would remove that authority. Nathan would be empowered to act on my behalf, and then the sale would close. The wedding, I understood now, had not been incidental to any of this. It had been part of the timeline. The event at the Hargrove had been engineered to impress the Meridian principals, several of whom, I later confirmed, had been among the guests that evening. It was a demonstration of the lifestyle and social capital that Nathan was selling them access to, the veneer of a dynasty and smooth transition from one generation to the next. Me standing at the entrance had been an unscripted problem. A grandmother with independent standing and a history of legal authority over the company, visible, present, emphatically not incapacitated, was incompatible with the narrative Nathan was selling. He had removed me from the frame. I drove home from Marcus's office in the early afternoon with a folder of copies and a very particular feeling in my chest that I recognized from 2 or 3 other moments in my life. The feeling of something that had been obscured finally becoming fully visible, like a shape in fog that sharpens as you keep walking toward it. It was not pleasant, but it was clarifying in the way that reality, however brutal, is always more useful than a comfortable story you've been telling yourself. I went to my study and I sat at my desk. Richard's desk, technically, the one I had moved from his home office after he died because it was a good desk and he would have laughed at me for being sentimental about leaving it. And I opened the folder and I started working. The first thing I needed was an independent financial assessment of the transfers. Not Marcus's initial review, but a forensic audit by someone with no relationship to Whitmore Holdings or any of its subsidiaries, someone Nathan couldn't reach, couldn't pressure, couldn't anticipate. I had a name in mind. A woman named Diane Foss, who ran a forensic accounting firm in Milwaukee, whom I had met at a finance conference 7 years ago, and whose reputation I had tracked with some admiration since. I called her directly. She was in a meeting. I left a message that said exactly this. "This is Evelyn Whitmore. I founded Whitmore International Holdings in Chicago. I need a forensic audit conducted urgently, with full discretion, on transactions that may constitute elder financial fraud. Please call me back today." She called back in 40 minutes. The second thing I needed was evidence of the manipulation itself. Not just the financial record, which was documentation of what had already been done, but proof of the intent behind it. The manufactured health concerns, the staged doctor visits, the deliberate isolation from Lillian. This was harder territory because it lived in conversations rather than documents. In the selective way, information had been channeled and withheld. But I was not without resources. I had kept every text message, every voicemail, every email from the past 2 years. I kept records because I had always kept records. It was a professional habit that Richard had once teased me about, calling me the most organized person he'd ever met in a tone that made it sound like a minor character flaw. Those records now constituted something considerably more valuable than I had known when I was accumulating them. I sat at that desk and I went through them. All of it. Every text from Nathan, every email from Clara, who had begun, about 18 months ago, copying herself on communications between Nathan and me, always with some stated justification, but persistently, consistently, establishing herself as a presence in correspondences she had no legitimate role in. I read the thread from last January where Nathan had gently, caringly, lovingly suggested that perhaps I was becoming overwhelmed by the administrative side of my life, and that it might be time to consider letting someone help. I read Clara's follow-up text, which arrived the next day, with links to assisted living facilities in the northern suburbs, sent under the framing of just doing some research, just in case it's ever useful. Last January, 9 months before Lillian's wedding. They had been planning this in some form for at least that long, possibly longer. The doctor visits, the facility research, the transfer of funds, the sale negotiation. This was not an impulsive scheme. This was a construction, built over time, layer by layer, by two people who had looked at me and calculated that age had made me manageable. By the time I reached the bottom of the message archive, it was past 9 in the evening, and I had been sitting at the desk for 5 hours, getting up only twice. My back was making its feelings about this known. I ignored it. There was one more call I needed to make that night, and it was the one I had been circling without directly approaching, the way you circle something that matters too much to risk. Lillian. My granddaughter was 27 years old, newly married, and currently, so far as I knew, entirely unaware that her father had filed a guardianship petition against her grandmother, or that the company her grandmother had founded was in the process of being sold out from under a woman Nathan had spent months engineering to appear incompetent. Lillian loved her father. She had been raised to love him, which was not a simple thing to untangle from simply loving him, and I understood that what I was carrying could not be dropped on her without care. I also understood something else, that Lillian's distance from me over the past year had not been her choice alone. The thinning of our contact, the strained calls, the sense I had felt of something being managed between us. That had been Nathan and Clara's work, I was almost certain. What they had told her, what version of me they had constructed for her consumption, I didn't know yet. But I knew that whatever she believed about why her grandmother was missing from her wedding, it had been put there by people with a significant interest in keeping us separated. I picked up my phone. I looked at her contact. Lillian, just the name, no prefix, the way you save someone you don't need a reminder to identify. I put the phone back down. Not tonight, not yet. Not until I had more of the picture, not until I was standing on ground solid enough that whatever I told her couldn't be dismantled by a counter-narrative Nathan would certainly have ready. If I called her now, half-armed, he would find out within hours and the story would shift to accommodate it. I had one opportunity to reach Lillian in a way that couldn't be explained away, and I was going to need it to count. Instead, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in almost 3 years, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had been my VP of operations for 17 years before taking early retirement to care for her mother, and who, I knew with the specific certainty of someone who had watched a person make consistent decisions for nearly 2 decades, had a loyalty to Whitmore Holdings that had nothing to do with whoever currently held the title of president. Patricia answered on the third ring with the cautious hello of someone who isn't sure who's calling at this hour. "Patricia," I said. "It's Evelyn." A short silence. And then, "Mrs. Whitmore, I was wondering when you'd call." I paused. "You were expecting me?" "Not tonight specifically," she said. "But, yes. In the last few months, things have been shifting inside the company that I don't think are right. I still have friends there, people who talk to me." Another pause. "I was actually going to reach out to you, but I didn't know if you'd... I wasn't sure what the situation was. There were some things Nathan said about your health, and I didn't know..." "My health is fine," I said. A longer silence. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Something looser in it, something that sounded like relief. "I was really hoping you were going to say that. I need to know what you've been hearing," I said, "from your contacts inside the company. I need you to tell me everything." And she did. Patricia talked for nearly an hour. I wrote it all down. Names of employees Nathan had pressured or replaced, changes in internal reporting structures that had quietly removed checks that would have flagged the financial transfers. A meeting, 3 months ago, between Nathan and 2 senior partners from Meridian Consolidated, held at a restaurant rather than at the offices, off the calendar, paid in cash. A conversation that one of the junior account staff had partially overheard, and then been discouraged, strongly, from mentioning to anyone. The thing about building a company from the ground up is that the people who come with you in the early years don't forget where things came from. They remember who was there when the stakes were real. Nathan had inherited those people the way you inherit furniture. He had never understood them as individuals, never understood what held them, never bothered to learn the difference between compliance and loyalty. He had looked at the company I built and seen an asset. He had never seen its soul. That was the mistake that was going to cost him everything. When I finally hung up with Patricia, it was close to 11 o'clock. I stood up from Richard's desk and stretched carefully, aware of my back and my neck and all the accumulated hours of tension in my shoulders. I looked around the study, the shelves of files, the framed company photograph from 1987 when we'd been 14 people in a converted warehouse, Richard standing slightly too close to me the way he always did. I thought about what I had at the end of this day versus what I'd had at the start of it. At the start, I had been a woman who had been dismissed from her granddaughter's wedding and had a bad feeling she couldn't yet explain. Now I had a forensic accountant engaged, an attorney in full possession of the financial records, a former VP with active intelligence from inside the company, and a growing map of what Nathan had actually constructed and who had helped him construct it. It wasn't enough yet. I needed more documentation, more witnesses, something that would be irrefutable in a room that mattered. But it was considerably more than Nathan thought I had, and that asymmetry was mine to use. I turned off the study light and went to bed. I didn't dream about the ballroom this time. I slept 5 hours, cleanly, the sleep of someone who has stopped waiting to understand what's happening and started deciding what to do about it. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was call a locksmith and have the locks on my apartment changed. A precaution. Nathan had a key. He had given me reasons, sensible ones at the time, for why he should have a key. Emergencies, my safety, the reasonable concerns of a devoted son. I had given him one 3 years ago without hesitation. The locksmith arrived at 8:15. While he worked, I stood in the kitchen and called Diane Foss's office to confirm the engagement scope. By 9 o'clock, I had new keys and a forensic audit in motion. By 9:30, my phone showed a text from Nathan. "Checking in," it said. "Hoped you got home safely Friday. Call me when you get a chance." I looked at the text for a long moment. The ordinary surface of it. The performed concern. The assumption that I would read it and feel reassured, or guilty for having left the event early, or eager to smooth things over the way people do when they mistake their own discomfort for a mutual problem. I set the phone face down on the counter and went to get dressed. I did not call him back. Nathan texted 3 more times over the following week. The first said he hoped I wasn't upset about the wedding, that it had been a complicated evening logistically, and he was sorry if there had been any confusion. Confusion. As though what had happened in the Hargrove lobby was a miscommunication rather than a deliberate act performed in front of witnesses. The second text asked if I'd seen the doctor lately and reminded me that Dr. Ellison was always available if I needed anything. The third was shorter. "Just checking in, Mom. Love you." I read all 3. I responded to none of them. This was, I knew, unusual enough to register. In the years since Richard died, I had been reliably available to Nathan. Sometimes too available, in the way that parents of adult children often are, filling a silence that the child has moved on from without quite saying so. A week of silence for me would be noticed, it would be interpreted, and that interpretation would likely generate some kind of response. I was counting on it. While Nathan was texting, I was working. The forensic audit with Diane Foss had moved quickly. She was efficient in the specific, unsentimental way of someone who had spent a career staring at numbers that told ugly stories, and within 5 days she had a preliminary report that confirmed what Marcus had found and considerably expanded it. The 11 transfers I already knew about were part of a larger pattern. There were also 17 smaller transactions, each individually beneath any reporting threshold, that had moved money from operational accounts into a vendor payment stream for a company called Greenfield Advisory Services, a company that, when Diane looked for it, did not appear to have any offices, any employees, any contracts with Whitmore Holdings and any legitimate records, or any discernible purpose beyond existing as a place where money could go and not come back from. Greenfield Advisory Services had been created 14 months ago. Its registered agent was a law firm in Wilmington, Delaware. Its single-listed director was a name I didn't recognize, a man named Douglas Firth. I gave the name to Marcus, who gave it to a private investigator he had used before, a former federal agent named Roy Calder, compact and precise and not given to unnecessary conversation, which I appreciated. Roy had a background in financial crimes investigation, which seemed fitting. Roy came back with Douglas Firth in 36 hours. Douglas Firth was 43 years old and lived in Naperville. He was Clara's younger brother. I sat in Marcus's conference room when he told me this, and I felt the particular quality of a thing clicking into place so solidly that you almost hear it. Clara. I had always known Clara was more than a passive participant. The red dress, the careful blankness, the hand on Nathan's arm at the Hargrove had told me that. But this was different from knowing she was involved. This was evidence that she had been the architect of the financial structure. Greenfield Advisory Services was her design. Douglas Firth was her instrument. The money flowing through that shell had a destination that connected directly back to her family. She built it before Nathan even knew what he was doing, I said. Marcus looked at me steadily. That would be consistent with the timeline. She found my son, I said. She married him. And then she figured out what he stood to inherit, and she built the mechanism to take it. I don't know exactly what I felt in that moment. Rage would be the obvious answer, and rage was certainly present, but it was layered under something more complicated. A kind of retrospective grief for Nathan, actually, which surprised me. Because if Clara had engineered this from the beginning, then my son was not simply a villain in this story. He was also, in some significant way, a victim of a person who had studied him and decided he was useful. That didn't excuse what he'd done. Not even close. But it complicated the shape of it in a way I hadn't anticipated, and I had to sit with that complication rather than flatten it, because the truth was more useful to me than a simpler story. I want everything on Clara Whitmore, I told Roy when Marcus set up a call. Her background before Nathan, her finances before the marriage, any prior relationships, any prior legal issues, everything. That'll take some time, Roy said. How much time? A week? Maybe 10 days for the full picture. You have a week, I said. In the meantime, I had other work to do. The guardianship petition was the most urgent legal threat, and Marcus had filed a formal response opposing it, asserting my full cognitive and legal competence, attaching preliminary financial documentation suggesting the petition was filed in bad faith as part of a broader scheme. The court had acknowledged receipt. We were now in a waiting period before the next procedural step, and Marcus was using that time to build the most comprehensive counter-record possible. But a court filing, however well constructed, was not going to be enough on its own. Courts move slowly. Nathan knew that. Whatever he and Clara had planned accounted for the likelihood of some legal resistance. They would have expected that I would push back eventually, would have built their timeline to accommodate a certain amount of legal friction. What they had not planned for was the possibility that I would move faster than they anticipated, or that I had resources they hadn't accounted for. There was something else I needed, something that would be harder to get and more devastating to them when I had it. I needed to hear them. Not metaphorically, I mean literally. I needed a recording of Nathan and Clara discussing what they had done and what they intended. Not because I needed it for my own understanding, which was by now almost complete, but because a recording in the voices of the people who had planned this was a form of evidence that could not be explained away, could not be reframed as a misunderstanding, could not survive a counter-narrative. A recording was the difference between a story and a fact. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction. 10 days into my silence, Nathan called. Not a text this time, a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon, which told me the silence had lasted long enough to make him genuinely uncertain. I watched the phone ring 3 times before I answered. Nathan, I said. Mom. His voice was warm in a way that used to reassure me and now made my teeth ache. I've been worried about you. You haven't been responding. I've been resting, I said. A beat. Are you feeling all right? I'm fine, I said. A little tired. I think all the activity lately has been a bit much for me. I want to be honest about what I was doing in that moment. I was not being honest. I was performing the version of myself that Nathan needed to believe in. The slightly diminished, slightly fatigued elderly mother who had been sufficiently managed by the events of the last week and was now retreating into the passivity he'd been cultivating in me for over a year. It felt wrong in my mouth, The way deliberately saying the wrong word feels wrong. But I held it. That's understandable, Nathan said, and I could hear the relief in his voice, subtle and quickly suppressed, but present. Claire and I have been talking, and we think it might be good for you to come stay with us for a little while, just while you're feeling low. We have the guest suite. It's comfortable. You'd have everything you need. There it was. The next step. The plan required proximity, required me in a space they controlled, surrounded by people they selected, with access to me that they could regulate. That's very kind, I said, keeping my voice warm and slightly vague. Let me think about it. Of course, he said. No pressure. I just want you to know we're here. We're here. The language of care, hollowed out and used as scaffolding for something entirely different. After I hung up, I sat for a moment with the phone in my lap. Then I called Patricia. Patricia had remained in the weeks since our first late-night conversation, one of my most reliable sources of information about what was happening inside Whitmore Holdings. She had contacts, former colleagues who still worked there, who trusted her, who were beginning to understand that something was wrong in the company they'd built their careers in. Through Patricia, I had learned that Nathan had scheduled a board meeting for 3 weeks from now. The agenda, circulated internally, described routine quarterly business. But Patricia's contact on the administrative staff had seen a second document, not circulated broadly, that outlined a proposal for a governance restructuring. Specifically, the introduction of a new executive authority structure that would effectively consolidate all major decision-making in Nathan's role and remove the existing checks that required founder approval for transactions above a certain threshold. They were removing me from the architecture of the company while I was still legally its founder. Patricia, I said when she answered, I need a favor, and it's not a small one. Tell me what you need, she said. There's a board member, I said. Gerald Hatch. He's been on the board since the beginning. Richard recruited him personally. I need to know where his head is right now, whether Nathan has gotten to him or whether he's been watching this and has concerns he hasn't been able to express. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Gerald called me last month, she said. He asked if I'd spoken to you recently. He said things were feeling off to him, but he didn't want to make trouble without knowing more. I felt something loosen slightly in my chest. Gerald Hatch. 70 years old, the kind of board member who had seen enough cycles of corporate malfeasance to recognize the early shape of one. He had been Richard's friend before he was a business associate. He had stood at Richard's funeral and cried openly, without embarrassment, which was something I had never forgotten. Tell him to call me, I said. Tell him I'm ready to talk. Gerald called that same evening. We spoke for 2 hours. He told me everything he'd been watching from his position on the board, the procedural irregularities, the agenda items that appeared and disappeared without explanation, the sense he'd had for months that the information being presented to the board had been curated in ways that obscured rather than illuminated the company's real financial position. I've been trying to figure out if I was imagining it, he said. I'm 70 years old. You start to wonder if you're just getting suspicious of things that have ordinary explanations. You weren't imagining it, I said. A long pause. Evelyn, how bad is it? Bad enough that I need you to do something for me, I said. I need you to go to that board meeting in 3 weeks, and I need you to not give Nathan any indication that we've spoken. And then what? He asked. Then wait, I said. I'll be there too. There was a silence on the line, and I could hear him processing this, the implications of it, the degree of trust it required from him to simply follow my direction without knowing the full plan. All right, he said finally. I trust you, Evelyn. I always have. The week that followed was the most operationally dense of my preparation. Roy Calder delivered his full report on Clara. Her name before the marriage had been Clara Whitfield. She had grown up in Peoria, the eldest of 4 children in a family that, by Roy's account, had been financially precarious for most of her childhood. Her father had cycled through failed business ventures. Her mother had worked 2 jobs. Clara had been, by every measurable standard, extremely intelligent and deeply motivated. She had put herself through college, gotten an MBA from a school with a good regional reputation, and worked in financial consulting for 8 years before meeting Nathan at a charity function in 2009. None of that was inherently damning. People come from hard circumstances and build themselves up, and there is nothing wrong with that. But Roy had found something else. Before Nathan, there had been another man, a man named Warren Price, 68 years old, widower, reasonably wealthy from a manufacturing business he'd sold in the mid-2000s. Clara had dated Warren for 14 months. During that time, Warren's adult children had become increasingly concerned about changes in their father's estate planning, specifically the quiet removal of certain assets from family trusts into accounts that Clara had been given signatory access to. The relationship had ended. Roy wasn't sure how or why, but it had ended abruptly. And Warren's children had subsequently discovered that approximately $900,000 had been moved and was unrecoverable without the kind of legal fight Warren himself had been unwilling to initiate. No charges had been filed. Warren had died 2 years later of a heart attack, and the matter had been buried in the general grief of settling his estate. Clara had done this before. Not at the same scale, not with the same complexity, but the shape of it was identical. Find a man with assets, establish intimacy and trust, create pathways for financial transfer, build in enough ambiguity that legal recourse was difficult. With Nathan, she had simply found a larger canvas and more time to work with. I read Roy's report twice, then I put it in the folder with everything else. The transfer records, the Greenfield documentation, the guardianship petition, the Meridian term sheet, and I looked at the full picture of what had been built against me. It was thorough. I gave them that. They had planned carefully, moved patiently, layered each element over a long enough timeline that no single piece of it had triggered alarm. If I had been a different kind of person, if age had actually done to me what they needed it to do, if I had become as dependent and confused and manageable as they required, it would have worked. All of it. By now, in this alternate version of events, I would have been somewhere quiet and supervised, and Nathan would have been signing documents with a power of attorney nobody had properly contested, and Whitmore Holdings would have been 63% sold to people whose only interest in it was how efficiently it could be liquidated. I thought about that version of events with a coldness that surprised me. Not because it was unimaginable. It was entirely imaginable. It was nearly what had happened, but because of what it said about how they had seen me, what category they had placed me in. An obstacle with diminishing capacity for resistance. A problem that would solve itself if you just waited long enough and kept applying the right pressure. They had looked at me and seen a woman at the end of things. I had spent a week proving that assessment wrong to myself, quietly, methodically, in the privacy of my own work. Now it was time to start proving it to everyone else. The recording came through Patricia, in the end, one of her contacts inside the company, a young woman named Renata, who worked as a personal assistant to Nathan's executive team and who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with what she was being asked to facilitate, had, on her own initiative, used her phone to record a conversation she had partially overheard and then been asked to join. It was a meeting in Nathan's private office, a week before the scheduled board meeting, between Nathan, Clara, and a man Renata identified as one of the Meridian Consolidated partners. Renata had not planned to record it. She told me this herself when Patricia brought her to my apartment on a Wednesday evening. A small, serious young woman in her late 20s who looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for longer than she'd known how to put down. "I didn't know what else to do with it," she said. "I went home that night and I kept thinking about the things they were saying, about you." "What were they saying?" I asked. She looked at her hands. Mr. Whitmore was telling the Meridian person that the guardianship was on track, that by the board meeting he said it would be resolved. And the Meridian person asked what that meant exactly, and Mr. Whitmore said that you would no longer have independent legal standing to interfere with any transaction. A pause. And then Mrs. Whitmore said, Renata stopped. "It's all right," I said. "Tell me." "She said you were the kind of woman who had always needed to believe she was in control of everything, and that all they'd had to do was be patient while you got old enough that the belief became, she called it, a habit without a foundation." Renata looked up at me. I'm sorry she said that." I looked at Renata for a moment, 28, maybe 29, sitting in my living room with her phone in her lap, and her jaw set with the particular tension of someone who has done something that scared her and isn't sure yet if it was the right call. "You did the right thing," I said. "I could lose my job," she said. "Yes," I said. "You could. I want to be honest with you about that. but I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that if you do, it's very briefly." She looked at me for a moment, really looked, the way people sometimes do when they're deciding whether to trust you. And then she nodded and handed me her phone. The recording was 43 minutes long. I listened to all of it that night, alone, after Renata and Patricia had left. Clara's voice was calm throughout. That was the thing I kept returning to as I listened, the absolute steadiness of her. No hesitation, no undercurrent of doubt, just the clean, flat efficiency of someone conducting business they have fully made peace with. She talked about the guardianship filing the way someone talks about a contract clause. Something to be managed, something with a timeline, something that would resolve itself into the outcome they required. Nathan's voice was different. There were moments in the recording where I heard something I recognized, a very slight roughness at the edges of his certainty, a barely perceptible hesitation before some of the harder statements. I don't know what that meant. I'm not sure I'll ever know what it meant, whether it was genuine conflict that he overrode or simply discomfort with the bluntness of hearing his plan articulated in a room with a stranger. But it was there, and I noted it, and I set it aside. The Meridian partner, a man named Terrence Vogel, based on the name Nathan used twice, asked specifically about the founder's shares, how they were structured, whether there was any mechanism by which Evelyn Whitmore could reassert shareholder rights even after a guardianship was in place. Nathan said there was not, that once the guardian was appointed, all legal authority transferred, that the transaction could proceed without any further, he used the word interference again, the same word he'd used with me at the Hargrove. Interference, as though my existence, my ownership, my decades of work were an inconvenience someone needed to manage. I turned off the recording. I sat in the quiet of my study for a while, Richard's desk under my hands, the framed photograph from 1987 visible in the low light, 14 people in front of a converted warehouse. Then I made 3 calls. The first was to Marcus. I told him about the recording, described its contents, and asked him what it was worth. "Depending on what's on it, it could be significant," he said. "Illinois is a one-party consent state. Renata was a participant in the meeting, which gives her the right to record it. If it contains what you're describing, it's potentially admissible, and it's certainly devastating in the civil context." "Good," I said. "I need you to prepare for the board meeting. I'm going to be there." A pause. "Evelyn, Nathan controls the agenda. He can remove you from the room." "He can try," I said. "I'm still the founder, and I still hold my shares. Let him try to remove me from a shareholder meeting on the record, in front of the full board, with what I'm about to walk in carrying." Another pause, longer. "All right," Marcus said. "What do you need from me?" "Prepare a full presentation," I said. "The transfers, the shell companies, the Meridian term sheet, the guardianship petition, and our opposition. Roy's report on Clara Whitfield. And the recording. I'll get you a copy tomorrow." "That's a significant amount of material to organize in 2 weeks," Marcus said. "I know," I said. "So we should probably start tonight." The second call was to Gerald Hatch, brief and practical. I was coming to the board meeting. I needed him to make sure the room stayed orderly when I arrived. He said only, "I'll be there," and I understood from his tone that he knew what I meant. The third call was the one I'd been waiting to make for 3 weeks. Lillian answered on the second ring. She sounded surprised, not in a bad way, but in the way of someone who has been waiting for a call they weren't sure would come. "Grandma," she said. Just that word. The way she said it, slightly breathless, slightly careful, told me something had been bothering her. That the absence from the wedding was not something she'd entirely accepted on the terms she'd been given. "Lillian," I said, "I need to see you, not on the phone, in person, just the 2 of us. Can you do that?" A pause. I heard her move, a door closing, the quality of the sound changing, as though she'd stepped into another room. "Yes," she said. "Tell me where." We met 2 days later at a small cafe in Lincoln Park, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and good coffee, and no particular reason for anyone who knew either of us to be there. Lillian arrived 3 minutes after I did. She was still in the glow of newlywed life in some visible way, something slightly softer in her face, but her eyes, when they found mine across the room, were serious. She sat down. She looked at me. And then, before I could say anything at all, she said, My father told me you didn't want to come to the wedding, that you'd said the travel would be too much, and that you'd sent your regrets. I looked at my granddaughter. He told me that in September, she said. 2 months before. He showed me a text he said was from you. Her jaw tightened. I thought it was strange. You hadn't said anything to me about it, but he said you'd been having some difficulties with your memory, that you sometimes said things and then forgot you'd said them, and that he was worried about you and was trying to protect your dignity by handling it quietly. She stopped. She was watching my face with a focus that I recognized. She had Richard's eyes, had inherited his particular quality of attention, the way he used to look at you when he was deciding what was true. I want you to tell me what actually happened, she said. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers, and then I told her everything. Not all of it, not the technical details of the financial fraud, not the full scope of what I'd been building over the past 3 weeks, but the truth of it, that I had arrived at her wedding, that I had been turned away by her father at the entrance, what he had said and how he'd said it, and what I had understood in the weeks since about why. Lillian listened without interrupting. This too was something she'd inherited. The ability to receive difficult information without immediately reaching for a reaction that would let her off the hook from having to fully feel it. When I finished, the cafe noise filled the space between us for a moment. Cups, conversation, the faint sound of something playing from a speaker in the back. He told me you didn't want to come, she said again, very quietly. Not repetition, more like she was holding the sentence up to light, examining it now that she knew what it was made of. I know, I said. And the stuff about your memory. My memory is fine, I said. She looked at me. She looked at me for a long time, and I saw it happen. The thing that happens when someone stops trying to find the innocent explanation for something and allows themselves to know what they already know. It was not a dramatic shift. It was very quiet, the quietest kind of devastating. What do you need from me? She asked. I squeezed her hand. Come to a board meeting with me, I said. In 2 weeks. Stand next to me and don't say a word. Just be there. Her eyes were wet, but her voice didn't waver. Okay, she said. I'll be there. I drove home from that cafe carrying something I hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The specific feeling of a weight you've been carrying alone that someone else has now agreed to share. Lillian knew. And she had chosen. Without pressure, without full information, without time to sit with it and be talked out of it by someone with an interest in her decision going the other way. She had looked at me across a cafe table and chosen her grandmother. 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks to finish building everything I needed to walk into that boardroom and dismantle what Nathan and Clara had constructed. For the first time since standing on that wet sidewalk outside the Hargrove, I felt something I could honestly call certainty. Not the absence of fear. I was not without fear, and anyone who tells you they walk into a fight of this kind without it is either lying or hasn't understood the stakes. But certainty underneath the fear. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and why, and having finally enough in your hands to do it. I went home. I sat at Richard's desk, and I went back to work. The 2 weeks between my meeting with Lillian and the board meeting were the most precisely organized of my life, which is saying something, because I had spent 4 decades running a company that required me to hold a great many things in careful order simultaneously. Every morning I was at Richard's desk by 6:30. Every evening I stayed until the work was done, which was rarely before 10. My back complained. My eyes complained. I ignored both of them with the same determined indifference I had applied to physical discomfort my entire adult life, which Richard had once described as my most admirable and most infuriating quality in equal measure. Marcus and I spoke every day, sometimes twice. The presentation he was building was substantial, 41 slides when he showed me the first draft, which I trimmed to 33 because I have always believed that the most powerful case is the one that doesn't waste the room's time, proving it knows how thorough it is. Every claim had a document behind it. Every document had a chain of custody we could articulate. The forensic audit from Diane Foss was organized into a standalone section that walked through each transfer in plain language. Not accounting language, not legal language, but the kind of English a person uses when they want another person to understand exactly what happened and exactly what it means. Roy Calder had provided a final supplemental report on Clara that included one additional detail he'd found in the last days of his research. A record from 2006, buried in a civil court filing in Peoria, of a small claims judgment against a Clara Whitfield for fraudulent misrepresentation in a private financial matter. The judgment had been for $11,000. The plaintiff had been an elderly woman named Ruth Denning. Clara had been 26. She had been doing this, in one form or another, since she was 26 years old. I looked at that record for a long time when Roy sent it over. $11,000 from an elderly woman in Peoria. Ruth Denning, whoever she was, probably hadn't had the resources to make more of it than a small claims filing. She had gotten her judgment and probably never collected it, and probably lived the rest of her life aware that she had been taken advantage of by someone who had looked at her and calculated that she was a safe target. I thought about Ruth Denning when the work felt heavy. I thought about Warren Price's adult children, who had watched their father's estate depleted and had no recourse because Warren himself hadn't wanted the fight. I thought about the shape of a life lived this way, always looking for the next person, always identifying the vulnerability, always building the architecture of trust specifically to exploit it. And then I went back to work. The night before the board meeting, I couldn't sleep. This was not unusual for the night before something important. I have always been this way, running through scenarios, checking my own preparation, finding the gaps I might have missed. I lay in the dark, and I went through the presentation in my head, slide by slide, statement by statement. I thought about the people who would be in that room, the 7 board members I knew with varying degrees of confidence, the Meridian representatives Nathan had arranged to attend as a standard observer courtesy, the legal and financial advisors on both sides. I thought about Nathan. This was the thing I kept returning to in the sleepless hours, the thing I couldn't fully resolve and had stopped trying to. What would it do to him? Not to his plan, not to his legal standing, not to his position at the company. I knew what it would do to all of those things, and I had no softness about it. What I kept circling was what it would do to him as a person. My son. The person I had held when he was 2 days old and understood, with a completeness I have never been able to adequately describe, that I would do anything to protect him. Somewhere between then and now, he had become someone I needed to protect myself from. I don't know where that happened. I genuinely don't. I had turned it over in enough sleepless hours that I had accepted I might never locate the specific moment, the exact turn where the road had gone somewhere I hadn't followed. Maybe there wasn't a single moment. Maybe it had been gradual, the slow accumulation of choices, each small enough to rationalize, that had added up over years into a person who could stand in a ballroom lobby and dismiss his mother in front of witnesses without a flicker of conscience. Or maybe Clara had found him at a moment of particular susceptibility and shaped what was already there into something more organized and more ruthless. I didn't know. I would probably never know. What I knew was that I was going to walk into that boardroom tomorrow and do what needed to be done, regardless of what it cost either of us. I got up at 5. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the city come light, the way it does in late November in Chicago. Slowly and without warmth, the sky going from black to a gray that never quite reaches blue. I drank the coffee. I thought about Richard briefly in the specific way I always thought about him before something hard, not as a comfort exactly, but as a reference point. He had been braver than he looked, which was saying something because he looked quite brave. He had never once, in all the years I'd known him, walked away from something because it was going to hurt. I put down the cup. I went to get dressed. I wore black. Not because I was performing anything, not grief, not severity, not the theatrical widow, but because it was the color I wore when I needed to think clearly and feel nothing in my clothing distracting me from the room. Black jacket, black trousers, a white silk blouse I'd had for 15 years because it fit correctly and did what it was supposed to do. No jewelry except my wedding ring and, after a moment of consideration standing in front of my mirror, Margaret's necklace. I clasped it around my own neck. Looked at myself. 72 years old. Hair gone silver in my early 60s, and I'd stopped pretending otherwise because life is short, and vanity is a significant use of energy that I have always had better applications for. Lines in my face that were the record of what I'd actually done, not what I'd looked like doing it. Eyes that, I have been told by several people over several decades, give very little away when I don't intend them to. I looked exactly like who I was. That was enough. Marcus met me in the lobby of the Whitmore Holdings building at 8:45. He had a leather case that contained printed copies of everything, 2 sets for the board, organized and tabbed, plus a laptop loaded with the full digital presentation and an audio file of Renata's recording. Roy was with him, which was not something I had planned, but which Marcus had arranged as a precaution, Roy's particular background making him useful if things became contentious in ways that required someone in the room who was practiced at not blinking. Lillian was already there, standing near the elevator bank in a charcoal coat, her hands folded in front of her. She looked like she had slept about as well as I had. When she saw me, she crossed the lobby without hurrying and put her arms around me, briefly and completely. "You ready?" she said into my shoulder. "Yes," I said. She pulled back and looked at my face the way she'd looked at me in the cafe. That Richard quality of attention, taking inventory. "You look like you're about to walk into a boardroom and burn it down," she said. "I'm going to walk into a boardroom and tell the truth," I said. "The burning is incidental." The corners of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. We took the elevator to the 28th floor. The boardroom at Whitmore Holdings occupied the northwest corner of the building and had, on clear days, a view of both the river and a slice of the lake. I had chosen that office space 30 years ago partly for this reason, because I believed that people made better decisions when they could see something larger than the room they were in. It was probably a naive idea, but it had been mine, and the view was still there, and this morning the river was the color of pewter and the sky was low. The room was already occupied when we arrived. Nathan was at the head of the table, his position now, the seat he had assumed when I stepped back from daily operations, and which he occupied with the easy authority of someone who has held it long enough that it no longer requires thought. Clara was seated to his left, which was slightly irregular. She held no formal role on the board, but Nathan had presumably arranged her presence under some advisory description, and no one had challenged it. 4 board members were already seated. Gerald Hatch, who caught my eye and gave me a look of such steady, contained relief that I had to briefly look away. 2 other longtime members, Doris Kwan and Philip Strand, who both startled visibly when I walked in, and a 4th member, a man named Stephen Cole, who had been appointed 2 years ago at Nathan's recommendation and whose expression when he saw me was the particular blankness of someone rapidly recalculating. At the far end of the table, occupying 3 chairs in a cluster, were the Meridian representatives. I recognized one of them from the description Patricia's contact had provided, a tall man with a careful suit and the watchful stillness of someone accustomed to observing rooms rather than performing for them. Terence Vogel. I had heard his voice on a 43-minute recording. He didn't know that yet. Nathan saw me at the same moment I saw him. He stood up. It was involuntary, I think. The standing. An instinct his body produced before his mind caught up with it. The old reflex of a child who stands when a parent enters the room. Then the calculation arrived, and he was no longer standing out of reflex, but out of a different kind of readiness entirely. "Mother," he said. The word came out with careful control, but underneath it, if you knew what to listen for, there was something that wasn't quite control, something that had the frequency of alarm. "This is, you're not on today's agenda." "I'm aware," I said. I walked to the table. I chose a seat deliberately, not at the far end, not in a corner, but 3 positions from Nathan on the right side, where I would be visible to everyone in the room and where the light from the northwest windows would be at my back. Lillian sat beside me. Marcus took the chair at the end. Roy stood near the door in the way that a man with his background naturally stands near doors. "This is a private board meeting," Nathan said. He was working to keep his voice level and largely succeeding. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside until—" "I'm the founder of this company," I said, without raising my voice. "I hold 22% of its outstanding shares. Under Article 7 of the corporate bylaws, any shareholder holding more than 15% has the right to attend any meeting of the board of directors with 48 hours notice, which my attorney provided in writing on Monday morning. I have every legal right to be in this room, Nathan." I watched him look at Marcus. Marcus looked back at him with the expression of a man who has been practicing law for 30 years and is entirely comfortable with silence. "The bylaw's provision," Nathan started, "is not subject to the president's discretion," Marcus said pleasantly. "It's structural. You'd need a bylaw amendment passed by the full board to change it, and you'd need to have done that before this morning. Nathan sat back down. The room was very quiet in the specific way of a room where everyone understands that something significant is happening and no one is yet certain of its shape. Clara had not moved. She was watching me with the same careful blankness I had seen at the Hargrove, that flat, controlled surface. But there was something different now, something small and hard in her eyes that had not been there when she believed she was managing a situation she controlled. She recognized, I think, in those first 30 seconds, that this was not what Nathan had told her to prepare for. Good. Nathan made one more attempt to manage the moment. I understand you have concerns you want to raise, he said, with the tone of someone trying to reframe a crisis as an item on an existing agenda. I think the appropriate thing would be to schedule time after the regular business is complete. We can give you the floor for 20 minutes at the end, and Nathan, I said, I'm not here for 20 minutes at the end. I'm here because the business you intend to conduct in this meeting is fraudulent, and the people in this room have a right to know that before they participate in it. The word fraudulent landed in the room the way that word always lands. Not loudly, but with a weight that changes the air pressure. Doris Kwan set down her pen. Philip Strand looked at Gerald, who was looking at me. Terence Vogel, at the far end of the table, was very still. Stephen Cole, Nathan's appointee, said, I don't think this is the appropriate forum for— It's exactly the appropriate forum, I said. This is the board of Whitmore International Holdings. Every person at this table has a fiduciary responsibility to this company and its shareholders. What I'm about to show you is directly relevant to that responsibility. If anyone would like to leave before I begin, they're welcome to, but I would recommend staying. Nobody left. I looked at Marcus. He opened the laptop. Over the past 14 months, I said, 28 transactions were conducted from Whitmore Holdings' primary and secondary operating accounts, totaling approximately $6.1 million. These transactions were structured specifically to avoid automatic regulatory review. They were authorized with my signature, signatures I provided on documents that were misrepresented to me as routine administrative paperwork. I paused. My forensic accountant, Diane Foss, has completed a full audit. I'd like to walk you through what she found. Marcus advanced to the first slide. The transfer records appeared on the screen behind me. Dates, amounts, account numbers. The paper trail that Diane had organized with the clarity of someone who understood that the most damning version of the truth was also the plainest one. I talked for 20 minutes without stopping. I had rehearsed this enough times that it required no notes, no prompting. I walked through the transfers, the shell structure of Arvine Capital and Greenfield Advisory Services, the role of Douglas Firth, Clara's brother, as the director of Greenfield, the pattern of money moving through entities with no legitimate business operations into accounts that had no traceable relationship to any actual corporate purpose. Nathan interrupted twice. The first time he said the transfers were part of an approved restructuring initiative and that the documentation would show appropriate authorization. The documentation shows my signature, I said. It does not show that I was given accurate information about what I was signing. That's not authorization. That's fraud. The second time, he said he would have his legal team address any concerns about the financial records and that the board shouldn't be making judgments on incomplete information. The information isn't incomplete, I said. It's very complete. That's the problem. Clara said nothing. She had not said a single word since I entered the room. She was watching the screen with the expression of someone doing very rapid internal mathematics, and I understood that she was calculating exits, not physical exits, but narrative ones, ways to position herself relative to what was unfolding that would minimize her personal exposure. I had expected this. It was why Roy was in the room. I moved to the Meridian term sheet. I watched Terence Vogel's face when the document appeared on screen. The term sheet that had been represented to him and his partners as the product of a clean, consensual transaction authorized by the appropriate principles of a company in orderly transition. This document, I said, describes the proposed sale of a 63% controlling stake in Whitmore Holdings to Meridian Consolidated Partners. I was not consulted about this transaction. I was not informed of it. It could not legally proceed without either my consent as a 22% shareholder with blocking rights under our shareholder agreement or the removal of my legal standing through the guardianship petition that my son filed with the Cook County Probate Court 3 weeks ago. I put the guardianship petition on the screen. The room changed again. Doris Kwan made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The involuntary expression of something registering harder than expected. Philip Strand leaned forward. Gerald was motionless in the specific way of someone who already knew this was coming and is watching the room receive it. The petition claims I am experiencing progressive cognitive decline that renders me unable to manage my own affairs, I said. It was filed by Nathan Whitmore. It is supported by reports from a physician, Dr. Ellison, who visited my home twice in the past 8 months, on visits arranged by Nathan, framed to me as wellness check-ins. I was not informed of their actual purpose. I looked at the board. I am 72 years old. I have full cognitive function. I built this company from 14 people in a converted warehouse in Bridgeport to the institution you're all sitting inside right now. The petition is not a health concern. It is the legal mechanism designed to complete a theft. Nathan stood up. This is... He stopped, sat back down, stood again. The composed certainty I had watched him perform at the Hargrove was fragmenting visibly now, the practiced ease giving way to something rawer underneath. This is an attack. This is a personal attack designed to... Mother, you don't understand the full picture of what I've been trying to do for this company. Sit down, Nathan, Gerald Hatch said. It came out quietly and absolutely. Gerald had not spoken before that moment, had sat through everything with the stillness of someone conserving something for when it was needed. Nathan looked at him, and whatever he saw in Gerald's face made him sit down without another word. Continue, Gerald said to me. I continued. I put Roy's report summary on the screen. The prior relationship between Clara and Warren Price, the asset transfers during that period, the unrecovered funds, Clara's real name before the marriage, the 2006 civil judgment from Peoria, Ruth Denning versus Clara Whitfield, $11,000 for fraudulent misrepresentation. Clara spoke for the first time. That is defamatory, she said. Her voice was controlled. Not calm. Controlled, which is a different thing, the sound of force being applied to contain something larger. Those records are private civil matters entirely unrelated to... They're public filings, Roy said from his position near the door, which was the first time he had spoken, and which had the mild, precise quality of a correction from someone who is not interested in debating the point. Clara looked at Roy, then she looked at me. I would like to speak to my attorney, she said. You're welcome to, I said. This presentation is 4 more minutes. I played the recording last. I had considered at length whether to play it in the room or simply submit it as documentary evidence. Marcus had advised that playing it in the room was higher risk, more visceral, less controllable in terms of reaction, but also potentially more decisive. I had decided that decisive was what I needed. A document can be questioned, contextualized, explained away by a sufficiently motivated defense. A voice is a voice. You cannot tell a room full of people that what they are hearing with their own ears is something other than what it is. The recording played through the laptop speakers. 43 minutes was too long for the room, so Marcus had prepared a 12-minute excerpt. The most legally and operationally significant sections, the parts where Nathan and Clara discussed the guardianship timeline, the parts where Clara described my belief in my own competence as a habit without a foundation, the parts where Terrence Vogel asked about founders' blocking rights, and Nathan assured him they would not be a factor. The room was absolutely silent for 12 minutes. I watched Nathan while the recording played. I want to be truthful about this. I did not watch him with satisfaction. I watched him the way you watch something you've been bracing for, with a kind of grief that runs alongside the necessity of what you're doing. He was very still. His hands were flat on the table. His face went through several changes that I won't pretend I could fully read. There was something that looked like shame at certain points, and something that looked like anger at others. And for a few seconds near the end of the excerpt, when Clara's voice said the thing about my habit without a foundation, he looked at the table in a way that I had not seen on his face since he was a child who had been caught in something he couldn't explain. When the recording ended, the silence held for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then Terrence Vogel said, "I'd like to take a recess." "Of course," I said. Vogel stood. His 2 colleagues stood. They left the room without looking at Nathan. The door closed behind them with a sound that had the quality of a verdict. Stephen Cole, Nathan's appointee, said he needed to make a call. He left also. That left Nathan, Clara, Gerald, Doris, Philip, Lillian, Marcus, Roy, and me. Nathan looked at me. And for the first time since the Hargrove ballroom, for the first time in what I was beginning to understand was a very long time, he looked like my son rather than the person my son had become. The composed executive had collapsed. What was underneath was something younger and considerably less certain, and it hurt to look at in a way I had not entirely prepared for. "You were going to take my company," I said. My voice came out steady and quiet. "You were going to lock me away somewhere and take everything I spent my life building." He didn't answer immediately. Clara put her hand on his arm. The same gesture from the Hargrove, the steadying grip, and he pulled his arm away from her. A small movement, barely visible. But I saw it. Gerald saw it. Lillian, sitting beside me, drew a very quiet breath. "I thought," Nathan started. He stopped. He looked at his hands. "She told me, Clara said you were already, that the decline was further along than you were admitting, and that if we didn't act, you would make decisions that you'd run the company into the ground, and there'd be nothing left for—" He stopped again. "For who?" I said. He didn't answer. "For who, Nathan?" I said. Not loudly, not with the edge of cruelty, because I didn't want cruelty, I wanted truth. "Who were you doing this for?" He looked at his wife. Clara was looking at the table. She was doing the only sensible thing available to her in that moment, which was nothing that could be used against her further until she had legal counsel present. Nathan looked back at me, and what I saw in his face was not the clean landscape of someone who had known all along what he was doing and had done it anyway. What I saw was more complicated and, in some ways, harder to sit with. A man who had convinced himself, over a long period of careful convincing, that what he was doing was something other than what it was. Who had let someone he loved tell him the story was about protecting people, and had chosen to believe it because it was more bearable than the alternative. That didn't make it forgivable. I want to be very clear about that. Understanding why someone does a terrible thing is not the same as excusing it, and I had never confused those two positions in my professional life, and I was not about to start. But it changed the shape of what I was looking at. And shapes matter, even when the thing being shaped is still a wound. "Clara has done this before," I said. I watched Nathan's face. "Not at this scale, but the pattern is not new. She targeted a man named Warren Price before she met you. Before that, a woman in Peoria named Ruth Denning. There is a documented history." I paused. "I don't know what she told you about me. I don't know exactly when the lie started or how much of what you believed was her construction and how much was something you chose. But I know she found you, and she studied what you stood to inherit, and she built a machine to extract it, and somewhere along the way you became part of the machine." Nathan was very still. "That doesn't make what you did to me acceptable," I said. "It doesn't come close to acceptable, but I thought you should know what she was." Clara stood up. "I'd like to leave the room," she said, to no one in particular. "You can leave," Roy said from near the door. "You should be aware that there are copies of this presentation and the audio file being submitted to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office this afternoon, and a civil complaint is being filed in the circuit court. You may want to make that call to your attorney sooner rather than later." Clara left. The door closed behind her, and she took with her, in that exit, in that tight, controlled walk across a boardroom she had helped construct through lies, the last structural element of the plan that had been built to erase me. The room settled into a different kind of quiet. Terrence Vogel and his colleagues returned 11 minutes later. Vogel sat down, looked at me for a moment, and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, Meridian Consolidated is withdrawing from the transaction. We were operating on representations about the company's governance situation that are clearly not accurate. We'll be in touch with your legal team to unwind the preliminary agreements." "Thank you," I said. After Vogel and his team left for the second and final time, the room contracted to its remaining occupants. Philip Strand asked what the board needed to do immediately. Marcus walked him through it. The guardianship petition would be withdrawn or opposed into dismissal. The financial transfers required unwinding through a court-supervised process. Nathan's executive authority needed to be suspended pending the legal investigation. Gerald made the formal motion. Doris seconded it. The vote was 4-0, Stephen Cole not present to vote. Nathan's authority was suspended by the board of the company his mother had built, in a room where the river was the color of pewter outside the northwest windows on a Tuesday morning in late November. He didn't fight it. I don't know if that was because he understood it was over or because, without Clara in the room, he simply didn't know what to do. He sat through the vote with the expression of someone who has used everything they had and has arrived at empty-handed, which is a particular look that I have seen in boardrooms before, and which is, in its way, one of the loneliest things a face can do. When the meeting formally adjourned, he stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He looked at me one more time, and what I saw was not the cold executive of the Hargrove ballroom and not the scheming partner of the recording. What I saw was Nathan, my son, 51 years old and terrified and alone in a room that used to be his. I had nothing to say to him in that moment, not because I didn't have words, but because the right words, if they existed, if we would ever reach a place where they were possible between us, were not words for a boardroom or a legal proceeding. They were for some future conversation that neither of us could access yet, if we could ever access it at all. He left. Lillian reached under the table and took my hand. I had not cried through any of this. I want to be clear about that, not because I am proud of it or think it reflects something admirable, but because I want to be accurate. I had been too focused, too operational, too aware that the room required a version of me that held together. But when Lillian's hand covered mine under that table, something shifted. Not collapse. Not the kind of crying that's grief in freefall. More the kind of release that happens when you've been carrying something at maximum tension for long enough that the moment the tension releases, your body simply acknowledges what it cost. I pressed her hand. She pressed back. "You okay?" she asked, very quietly. I thought about that. The actual answer to it, not the reflexive one. "Not entirely," I said, "but I will be." She nodded. That was the right answer, and we both knew it. Marcus was quietly organizing his materials. Roy had already slipped out. He was not a man who lingered in rooms after the work was done. Gerald Hatch remained, seated at his place near the window, looking out at the river with the expression of someone who has just witnessed something important and is taking a moment to let it settle into him. After a while, without turning from this window, he said, "Richard would have had a word for today." A pause. "I can't think of it right now, but he would have had the right one." I looked at the back of Gerald's white-haired head, the river behind the glass. "He usually did," I said. The morning had turned, incrementally, toward something that might eventually become afternoon. The pewter color of the sky had shifted to something slightly less heavy. Not brightness exactly, but the suggestion of light somewhere behind the cloud cover, working its way through. I sat in that boardroom for a few more minutes after everyone else had gathered their things and moved toward the door, just the two of us left. Lillian still beside me, neither of us needing to fill the quiet. Then I stood. I straightened my jacket. I felt, in my body, the accumulated weight of the morning, the sleepless night before it, the weeks of preparation before that, the October evening on a wet sidewalk that had started all of it. I felt 72 years old in a way that was not diminishment, but simply reality. The reality of a body that had been working at high capacity for an extended period and was making its accounting known. I picked up my bag. I looked around the boardroom one last time, the northwest windows, the river, the table I had sat at for 30 years, making decisions that had built the institution these walls contained. Then I walked out. The weeks that followed the board meeting had a quality I hadn't anticipated. I had expected relief. I had expected the particular exhale of someone who has been holding their breath through something dangerous and has finally reached the other side of it. What I got instead was something more complicated and considerably less comfortable, a kind of suspended stillness, like the air after a storm has passed but before you've gone outside to see what it left behind. The legal machinery had been set in motion, and it moved the way legal machinery always moves, with grinding, procedural certainty that is reassuring in its thoroughness and maddening in its pace. Marcus filed the civil complaint. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office opened a preliminary inquiry into the financial transfers, which Roy had anticipated, and which the documentation we provided accelerated considerably. The guardianship petition, stripped of its primary advocate once Nathan's authority was suspended, collapsed within 10 days. The court dismissed it without prejudice, which meant Nathan could theoretically refile. But Marcus had built a counter-record so comprehensive that refiling would have been an act of either desperation or delusion. Clara retained an attorney within 48 hours of the board meeting. I had expected this. What I had not fully anticipated was how quickly she moved to create distance between herself and Nathan. Not physical distance, not yet, but legal and narrative distance, the kind that a person builds when they are calculating their own survival and have decided that the person beside them is more useful as a boundary than as an ally. Her attorney sent a letter to Marcus suggesting that Clara's involvement in the financial arrangements had been at Nathan's direction, that she had acted in good faith on representations he had made to her about his authority over company assets, that she was prepared to cooperate with any investigation in exchange for appropriate consideration. She was going to put it on Nathan. I read that letter in Marcus's office on a Thursday morning, and I sat with it for a long time before I said anything. There was something almost clarifying about it. The absolute completeness of who Clara was, revealed in a single legal document. She had used Nathan as an instrument for years, had shaped him and directed him and provided the architecture for everything that had been done. And now that the structure was collapsing, she was going to step away from the rubble and point at him and say, "He built that." Roy's report on Warren Price, Ruth Denning, the pattern, stretching back 20 years. "Will it work?" I asked Marcus. "Depends on what the state's attorney finds and what they decide to prioritize," he said. "Clara's exposure is significant. The Greenfield structure connects directly to her brother, and the paper trail through Douglas Firth is not going to survive serious scrutiny. But she has something Nathan doesn't." "What's that?" "She never signed anything," Marcus said. "Every authorization in this case bears your signature or Nathan's. Clara was very careful to keep her name off the formal documents." I had thought about this. Of course I had. It was the kind of structural detail you recognize when you understand how a scheme was built. And I had spent enough time studying the architecture of what Clara had constructed to understand where the load-bearing walls were. She had built herself a floor above the wreckage. Not perfectly. Roy's documentation of Douglas Firth, the prior Warren Price situation, the Peoria civil judgment. None of that was going away, and the state's attorney would have it all. But the criminal threshold was harder to meet when your name was on nothing. "What about Douglas Firth?" I asked. "His attorney reached out yesterday," Marcus said. "He's cooperating fully. Apparently the arrangement was presented to him as entirely legitimate. He was told he was serving as a nominee director for a tax optimization structure. He says he had no knowledge of the underlying fraud." "Do you believe that?" Marcus considered. "I believe it's possible. Clara is capable of compartmentalizing very effectively. Whether Douglas fully understood what he was part of or chose not to ask questions that would have told him, that's for the investigators to determine." I nodded. The world is full of people who don't ask the questions that would require them to know things they'd rather not know. That's not innocence, but it's not always the same thing as guilt, and I had learned over a long career that the difference matters even when it's inconvenient. I left Marcus's office and walked back to my car in the cold December air. The city was already moving toward the holidays. Lights in some of the shop windows, a vendor on the corner selling chestnuts from a cart. The particular briskness in the pedestrian traffic of people who have somewhere to be and are calculating the fastest route there. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in. I thought about Nathan. He had moved out of the house he shared with Clara within 2 weeks of the board meeting. Patricia heard this through her contacts, and then Lillian confirmed it. Nathan had called Lillian, which surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Whatever else had fractured, whatever judgment he was coming to about the woman he had married and the choices he had made, the instinct to reach for his daughter was, I thought, one of the more human things he had done in recent memory. Lillian told me about the call carefully, the way she had learned to navigate information between two people she loved who were on opposite sides of something very deep. "He sounded terrible," she said. "We were at my kitchen table, coffee between us, a Sunday afternoon in December with snow starting outside the window." "I imagine he does," I said. "He didn't try to justify it," she said. "I thought he would. I had things prepared to say if he did. But he said he was sorry. To me. That I hadn't known what was happening, that he'd kept me away from you, that the story he told me about the wedding wasn't true." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "He said he didn't fully understand until everything came apart, how much of what he believed had been constructed for him. I was quiet for a moment. "Do you believe him?" I asked. Lillian thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "I believe he believes it," she said finally. "Whether that's the complete truth or whether it's the version he needs it to be, I don't know yet. I'm not ready to know yet." That was an honest answer, and I respected it. "What did you say to him?" I asked. "I said I needed time," she said, "and that I couldn't have a conversation about forgiveness until I understood what I was being asked to forgive." She looked at me. "Was that wrong?" "No," I said. "That was exactly right." She nodded slowly. Then, "What about you? Do you think you'll ever—" She stopped. "I don't know how to ask this." "You're asking if I'll forgive him," I said. "Yes." I looked out the window at the snow. Light and steady, the kind that accumulates slowly and quietly, and you don't notice how much has gathered until you look directly at it. The honest answer was that I didn't know. I had spent 72 years on this earth, and I had learned, among other things, that forgiveness is not a decision you make once and then possess. It's a process, and it's not linear, and it is not something you can rush because the other person needs you to be finished with it. Nathan had done something that I would be processing for the rest of my life. Not just the legal fact of it, not just the financial damage, but the specific wound of having been looked at by your own child and seen as an obstacle, a complication, a problem to be solved. That wound doesn't close on a timeline that anyone else gets to set. "I don't know," I told Lillian. "That's the most truthful thing I can say." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, the same gesture from the boardroom, the same warmth of it. "That's enough," she said. "That's more than enough." The civil case moved forward through December and into the new year. Diane Foss testified in a deposition that ran 2 full days, and which Marcus described afterward as the most thorough and unassailable financial testimony he had seen in 30 years of practice. The Greenfield structure was fully unwound. Douglas Firth, in his cooperation, provided the account information that allowed the transferred funds to be traced and frozen. The recovery process for the $6.1 million would take time, Marcus warned me. Civil recovery always did. But the money had not been spent, only moved, and moved into structures that had now been fully exposed. The likelihood of substantial recovery was, in his professional assessment, high. Claire's attorney had been correct that her careful removal of her name from formal documents created meaningful legal ambiguity. The state's attorney's investigation was ongoing, and I had been advised not to expect rapid resolution on the criminal side. What I could control, I had controlled. What the legal system would do with it was the legal system's business. And I had enough experience with institutions to understand that they move at their own pace and in their own direction, and that demanding otherwise is an exercise in frustration. What I focused on instead was the company. Whitmore Holdings without Nathan at its operational helm was initially a challenging environment. He had been in the president's role for 9 years, and whatever his character flaws, he had made structural decisions in that time that had embedded his approach throughout the organization. Some of those decisions had been good ones. He was not without ability. That was one of the complicated truths I had to hold, that the son who had done what he'd done was also the same person who had, in the years before Clara's influence had fully calcified his judgment, made genuinely sound decisions on behalf of the company. The two things coexisted. Reality rarely provides you with villains who are only villains. The board appointed an interim president, a woman named Caroline Marsh, who had run the Midwest operations for the past 6 years, and who I had, frankly, had my eye on for longer than I'd formally articulated, because she had the specific quality of attention to institutional detail that the best operators possess, and that is extremely difficult to teach someone who doesn't already have it. Caroline was 53, methodical, and possessed of a dry sense of humor that surfaced at unexpected moments, and had the effect of making difficult meetings slightly more bearable, which is underrated as a leadership quality. I came back into the company in an advisory capacity, not executive. I was clear about this with the board and with myself. I was 72 years old, and I had no interest in pretending that meant nothing. What it meant was that I had a particular kind of vision and a particular kind of institutional memory that was useful in a specific role, and that role was not the same as the role I had held at 45. The company had changed. I had changed. The work of the next phase was different from the work of any previous phase, and the only way to do it honestly was to be accurate about what I was bringing to it. What I brought was this. I knew where the company had come from. I knew what it was built to be, not just operationally, but in terms of its character, the way it treated its people, the way it honored its commitments, the kind of reputation it carried in its industry. Nathan had eroded some of that in his years running it, partly through neglect and partly through the specific effect of a man who saw the company as an asset to be managed rather than an institution to be tended. There were relationships that needed repair. There were people inside the organization who had stayed because they believed in what the company had been and had been waiting, quietly, for some indication that the thing they'd believed in still existed. Patricia came back. I had not asked her to. I had been careful not to ask, because her returning needed to be her decision, free of any sense of obligation. But she called me on a Tuesday in January and said she'd been thinking about it, and that the organization she'd spent 17 years in needed people who remembered what it was supposed to be, and that she was ready to come back if there was a role. There was a role. We created it specifically for her, a senior operations advisor function that formalized what she'd been doing informally. The institutional knowledge, the network of relationships, the specific quality of someone who understands a company not just as a structure, but as a community of people with shared purpose. Renata, the young woman who had provided the recording, was still employed at the company and had been, in the aftermath of the board meeting, in an uncomfortable position. She had done something courageous, and it had not been without professional cost. Nathan's absence had created a power vacuum in the executive team, and the people who had been most closely aligned with him were not, initially, inclined toward warmth in their treatment of someone they understood had played a role in his downfall. I was aware of this. Caroline was aware of this. By the end of January, Renata had been moved into a new position in the legal compliance team, a role that suited both her skills and her demonstrated commitment to institutional integrity, with a salary adjustment that reflected both. I told her myself, in a brief meeting in Caroline's office, that what she had done had required courage, and that the company owed her a debt it couldn't fully repay, but intended to partially address through treating her with the respect she had earned. She looked at me across the conference table and said, "I just didn't want to be someone who knew and did nothing." I thought about that for a long time afterward, the simplicity of it. The moral clarity of a 28-year-old woman who had looked at a situation, understood its stakes, and made a decision based not on what was safe or advantageous, but on what was right. She hadn't had access to the tools I had, the resources, the legal architecture, the 40 years of experience understanding how power moves through institutions. She had had a phone and a conscience and the willingness to act on what they told her. That was enough. That had been, in many ways, the turning point. I didn't want to be someone who knew and did nothing. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count since she said it to me. It strikes me, in my better moments, as one of the finest moral compasses a person can carry. Not a complicated philosophy, not a sophisticated framework, just a clear-eyed refusal to be complicit in wrong through the simple convenience of looking away. I had spent my whole life trying to live by some version of that principle without ever articulating it that cleanly. A 28-year-old woman in a compliance role handed it to me in 11 words. The spring brought several things at once, the way springs do when you've survived a winter that demanded a great deal of you. The civil judgment came through in April. The court-supervised recovery process had moved faster than Marcus had expected. The frozen assets were substantial, and the fraud documentation was comprehensive. And the final order required the return of $5.8 million to Whitmore Holdings, with the difference covered by a personal judgment against Nathan for damages. Marcus had warned me it would take time to collect the personal judgment, that Nathan's personal liquidity was uncertain in the aftermath of everything, and I told him to proceed but not to make it a crusade. The company's money was the priority. The personal accounting could follow its own timeline. Clara's situation resolved in a way that was both satisfying and deeply unsatisfying, which is usually how justice works in the real world, as opposed to the version of it we tell ourselves in stories. The state's attorney declined to bring criminal charges against her on the Whitmore-related conduct, citing insufficient direct evidence of her criminal intent absent her name on any formal document. However, the investigation had unearthed enough about the Warren Price situation. Some of the transferred funds, it turned out, had not entirely disappeared, and Roy's original research, shared with the state's attorney, led to the reopening of inquiries that had never been properly initiated. That Clara found herself under separate scrutiny in a jurisdiction that had resources her original victims hadn't. I was informed of this development by Roy on a Wednesday morning in March, in the specific, precise way that Roy delivered information that he considered significant. "The Price estate has retained civil counsel," he said. "Based on what came out of the Whitmore investigation, they believe they have a viable claim. The state's attorney in DuPage County has opened a preliminary inquiry." I thought about Warren Price's adult children, about Ruth Denning, the woman in Peoria, who had been 26-year-old Clara's first documented victim, who had gotten an $11,000 small claims judgment and probably never collected it, about the specific quality of someone who spends decades identifying vulnerable people and extracting value from them, moving on, finding the next one. "Good," I said. Clara and Nathan had separated formally by February. The divorce proceedings were going to be complicated. There were assets, there were disputes about what had been jointly held versus individually owned, and Clara's attorney was going to argue positions that Marcus described as creative and Roy described as predictable. It was going to take a long time and cost a significant amount of money and produce an outcome that would satisfy no one entirely, which is also how divorce generally works. I had no interest in the details. That was their terrain to navigate, and I had enough of my own. What I found, as the spring progressed, was that the thing I had expected to feel, a settled, complete sense of resolution, the narrative satisfaction of wrongs addressed and order restored, was not quite what I was actually feeling. The legal outcomes were real and important. The company was stabilizing under Caroline's leadership in ways I found genuinely encouraging. Patricia was back. Renata was thriving in her new role. The institution I had built was going to survive. And yet, the thing that doesn't appear in the version of this story where it's only about triumph is the grief. The ongoing, complicated, not resolving grief of a mother who has had to look her own child directly in the face and dismantle everything he built, including his belief that he was still standing on solid ground. The grief of understanding that something was broken between Nathan and me that might never fully heal, not because healing was impossible in principle, but because healing takes two people willing to do the work, and I didn't yet know if Nathan was capable of the specific kind of honest reckoning that work would require. He had called me. Once. In February on a Sunday evening, from what Lillian said was a rented apartment in Evanston. He'd left the marital home, left the neighborhood, left most of the visible infrastructure of the life he had built with Clara, and was apparently trying to figure out what, if anything, remained underneath it. The call lasted 22 minutes. I had written down the time afterward, not deliberately, but because I looked at the phone when it ended and the number was there, and it seemed like something worth noting. He didn't make excuses. That was the thing that surprised me most. I had expected excuses, or the sophisticated cousin of excuses that sounds like self-examination, but is actually still centered on protecting your own image. What Nathan did instead was something harder and less polished. He simply told me what he remembered, how it had happened, from his perspective. When Clara had first raised the idea that I was struggling, how she had framed it, not as exploitation, not at first, but as concern, as the natural and loving response to watching a parent age. How he had wanted to believe it because it gave him permission to do things he'd told himself were in my best interest. He said he didn't think that excused anything. He said he knew it didn't. He said he had been sitting in the rented apartment for 3 weeks trying to figure out who he was outside of the story. Clara had been telling him about himself for 15 years, and that he wasn't sure yet. That it was like trying to remember what your handwriting looks like when you haven't written anything in a long time. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt, and I didn't offer easy comfort, because easy comfort at this point would have been a disservice to both of us. When he was done, I said, "I believe that you believe what you're telling me. I also need you to understand that the experience of being on the other side of it, of being the one who was described as diminished, who was turned away from her granddaughter's wedding, who had papers filed against her in a probate court, that doesn't become less real because your intentions were complicated." "I know," he said. "I'm not ready to know what comes next between us," I said. "I need you to understand that and not push against it." "I understand," he said. "If you're serious about understanding what happened," I said, "then do the work. Not for me. For yourself." Figure out who you are outside someone else's construction of you. That's your work to do, and I can't do it with you right now. A long pause. Okay, he said. His voice was rough and unperformed, the voice of a person who is not managing their presentation because they've run out of the resources required to do that. Take care of yourself, Nathan, I said. I hung up. I sat at Richard's desk in the quiet apartment, the February dark outside the windows, the lamp throwing its small circle of light over the surface of the desk, and the photograph of 14 people in front of a warehouse, and the velvet pouch I still kept in the top drawer because I had not yet found the right moment to give Margaret's necklace to Lillian. I cried after that call. I want to put that in the record because I think it matters. Not the controlled, contained release of the boardroom moment, but the real kind. The kind that takes you by surprise with how much is in it. How many layers of grief have been stacking up in a person who has been too operational for too long to let them surface properly. I cried for Nathan as he had been, and for what he had become, and for the specific impossibility of loving someone fully while also needing to protect yourself from them. I cried for Richard, who was not here to navigate any of this, who would have known things to say that I couldn't access alone. I cried for the grandmother who had stood on a sidewalk in October in a navy dress with a necklace in her bag and a clear-eyed understanding that something was terribly wrong, and who had done what needed to be done without fully knowing, in those first weeks, whether she had the reserves to see it through. I had the reserves. That was the thing I knew now that I hadn't been entirely certain of then. You don't fully know what you're made of until something demands to find out. 72 years of accumulated evidence about my own character had suggested certain things, but evidence and proof are different categories, and there is a specific kind of knowing that only comes from having passed through something that could have broken you and finding yourself still standing on the other side of it. I was still standing. Lillian's husband, his name was Daniel, a quiet, careful man who worked in architecture and who had, in the months since the board meeting, revealed himself to be considerably more substantial than the peripheral figure I'd known him as before, had said something to me at a family dinner in March that I had thought about many times since. We had been washing dishes after the meal, a domestic thing that I mentioned because its ordinariness was part of what made what he said feel significant, and he had said, without preamble, "I want you to know that what you did, the way you handled all of it, I think it's one of the most impressive things I've ever seen a person do." I had thanked him, and then he had said, "I don't mean the legal strategy or the boardroom. I mean the fact that you never stopped being yourself through any of it. You never let them make you into who they needed you to be." I thought about that for a long time. Never let them make you into who they needed you to be. This is, I have come to understand, one of the most fundamental battles that anyone who is perceived as vulnerable will eventually face. And it is a battle that is fought not once, but continuously, in the small daily moments as well as the large ones. It is fought every time someone tells you what you can't do anymore, what you're no longer capable of, what you should leave to younger people with sharper minds. Every time someone looks at your age or your gender or your circumstances and calculates that you are more manageable than you appear. The specific cruelty of what Nathan and Clara had done was not only the money, not only the legal jeopardy, not only the social humiliation of being turned away at that ballroom door. It was the attempt to rewrite me, to replace the person I actually was with a diminished, confused, dependent version of me that would require management, that would, in their hands, become whatever they needed in order to take what they wanted. They had needed me to be small. They had built an entire architecture around the belief that age had made me small. And the thing that I kept coming back to, in the months of processing that followed the board meeting, was not how close they had come to succeeding. Though they had come close, there was no useful purpose in pretending otherwise. What I kept coming back to was the question of what had stopped them. The answer was not complicated. It was not a single dramatic decision made in a single dramatic moment. It was smaller and more accumulative than that. It was every year of building something real and knowing what that felt like. It was the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of my own competence. Not arrogance, not the refusal to acknowledge limitation, but the deep foundational certainty of a person who has done difficult things and knows, in her bones, what she is capable of. It was Richard's desk under my hands at 5 in the morning. It was Patricia's voice on a late-night phone call. It was Gerald Hatch, saying, "Sit down," in a boardroom in a tone that stopped my son mid-sentence. It was Renata and her phone and her 11-word moral compass. It was Lillian reaching across a cafe table and saying, "Tell me what actually happened." It was not me alone. That is the other thing I kept returning to, the thing that complicated the solitary triumph version of this story. I had not done this alone. The idea that any person navigates a crisis of this scale through sheer individual will is a satisfying narrative and a mostly false one. What I had was a network, built over decades of showing up, of being trustworthy, of treating people as individuals rather than instruments. Marcus, who had answered his phone on a Friday night at 7:30 without hesitation. Patricia, who had stayed connected to the institution because the institution had once been worth staying connected to. Gerald, who had waited and watched and been ready when the moment came. Renata, a young woman I had never met before, she sat in my living room with her phone in her lap. None of them had any obligation to do what they did. They did it because they had their own relationship to what was right, and because some of them, not all, but some, had a relationship to me built through years of accumulated trust that meant something when it was tested. I have thought about this in the context of everything people think they understand about aging, about what it means to grow old in a world that treats age as a deficit, as something to be managed, compensated for, worked around. There is a narrative that circulates, sometimes loudly, and sometimes in the quieter language of assumptions and small exclusions, that says the older you get, the less you matter, the less you are capable of, the more appropriate it becomes for other people to make decisions on your behalf, to speak for you, to arrange your life according to their understanding of your limitations. I want to be very direct about this. That narrative is not only wrong, it is dangerous. It is dangerous because it creates the conditions for exactly what Nathan and Clara attempted, the systematic dismantling of an older person's agency under the guise of care. It is dangerous because it convinces its victims, sometimes, before it convinces anyone else. Because the most effective cruelties are the ones that make you doubt your own perception before you doubt theirs. The antidote is not the pretense that aging changes nothing. It changes things. My body knows things it didn't know at 50, not all of them welcome. My energy has a ceiling that I monitor now with a pragmatism I couldn't have managed at 35. There are limits, real ones, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. But limits are not the same as diminishment. Knowing what you can't do is not the same as becoming someone who can't do anything. And the wisdom that accumulates in a person who has actually lived, who has built things, lost things, made mistakes and corrected them, buried people they loved and kept going, that wisdom is not nothing. It is not a consolation prize for the loss of youth. It is its own form of resource, real and applicable and irreplaceable. I knew what I was doing in that boardroom because I had spent 40 years learning how rooms like that work. I knew how to build a case because I had spent 4 decades building cases in contexts that taught me everything about what evidence looks like when it's sufficient and what a presentation accomplishes when it's ruthlessly honest. I knew how to not flinch when Nathan looked at me because I had survived enough things that required me not to flinch, that my nervous system had developed some proficiency in it. None of that was despite my age. All of it was because of it. In June, I had lunch with Gerald Hatch at a restaurant near his apartment in Lincoln Park, a small Italian place he'd been going to for 20 years, and where the owner knew him by name and brought him a particular wine without being asked. We ate slowly, in the way of people who don't have anywhere they urgently need to be, and talked about the company and the spring and things that had nothing to do with either. At some point, Gerald said, "I've been thinking about something you said in the boardroom. You said the petition was the legal mechanism designed to complete a theft." "Yes," I said. "I've been thinking about how many people that happens to," he said, "who don't have what you had, who don't have a Marcus or a Roy or a Patricia, who don't have 40 years of boardroom experience and a forensic accountant and a board member who was their husband's friend." He was quiet for a moment. "How many people just go along because they're exhausted, or because they've been told often enough that they're confused, or because the legal system is incomprehensible and expensive and the person doing it to them is their family?" I had thought about this too, many times. "Quite a few," I said. "Is there something to do about that?" he said. I looked at him across the restaurant table. Gerald Hatch, 70 years old, a man who had spent 50 years in business and had reached the point in his life where what he had time for was the things that actually mattered. I've been thinking about that, I said. There's an organization, not for profit, legal support and advocacy for elderly adults facing financial exploitation by family members. I paused. I've been talking to some people about the possibility of endowing a program, something that could provide the kind of legal and forensic support that I had access to people who don't. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'd like to be part of that conversation. I was hoping you'd say that, I said. The thing about surviving something is that you're left with a choice about what to do with the fact of having survived it. You can carry it privately, as a personal victory, a story you tell yourself when you need reminding that you're capable. There is nothing wrong with that. Self-knowledge is its own form of resource. Or you can look at what you learned and ask whether it has an application larger than your own situation. I had spent 40 years building Whitmore Holdings because I believed, with the specific stubborn certainty of someone who had started from nothing, and needed that belief to be true, that building something real was worth the cost of building it, that an institution with genuine values, operated with genuine integrity, was worth the daily, grinding, unromantic work of maintaining it against all the forces that would rather it be something easier. That belief had not been altered by what had happened. If anything, it had been sharpened. Because what I had discovered in the months of unraveling Nathan and Clara's scheme was not only the depth of the betrayal, but the depth of the counter-network. The people who had held on, who had waited, who had been ready to act when someone gave them a reason to believe the thing they'd built their professional lives on was still worth protecting. That was what institutions are supposed to produce. Not invulnerability. Nothing human is invulnerable, but resilience. The capacity of a thing built with real values to survive the people who try to hollow it out, because the values have been embedded in enough individual people that when the hollowing reaches a critical point, the people resist it. I had built that. Imperfectly, over 40 years, with a great many mistakes I won't pretend weren't mistakes. But I had built it, and it had held. On a Sunday in July, I had Lillian over for dinner, just the two of us. Daniel was visiting his parents in Seattle, and Lillian had called that morning and said she had nothing to do and asked if she could come over, which made me feel something I don't entirely have language for. The specific warmth of someone choosing your company, not out of obligation, but out of genuine preference. I made what I could make, a pasta dish I'd been making since the 1980s, and which I am fully aware is not sophisticated, but which is good, and which Richard had asked for every time he'd been tired or sad or needed something simple and certain. We ate in the kitchen. We talked about easy things, inconsequential things, the texture of an ordinary Sunday evening. After dinner, while Lillian was washing the dishes and I was drying them, a domestic rhythm that we had fallen into naturally, without discussion, the comfortable parallel activity of two people who are simply together. I went to the drawer and took out the velvet pouch. Lillian turned off the water. She looked at what I was holding. "Is that?" she started. "Margaret's necklace," I said. "I brought it to your wedding. I was going to give it to you there." I looked at the pouch in my hands, the small, solid weight of it. I've been waiting for the right moment since October. Lillian dried her hands on the dish towel. She was very still. "This belonged to your great-grandmother," I said. "Richard's mother. She was a woman who worked hard for everything she had and never asked for anything, and was, in her own quiet way, the toughest person I ever met. Richard gave it to me because he said I reminded him of her." I paused. I wore it to the boardroom in November because I needed to be reminded of where things had come from, what they were made of. I looked at Lillian. "I want you to have it now." Lillian's eyes were wet. She was doing what she always did when she was trying not to cry, which was lift her chin slightly and breathe very carefully, which was something she had been doing since she was 7 years old and had never quite managed to make less visible. "Grandma," she said. "It doesn't come with conditions," I said. "It's not a symbol of obligation or tradition you're required to carry, or anything you didn't choose. It's just—" I stopped for a moment. "It's the most valuable thing I own, and I want it to be with the person I trust most to understand what value actually means." She came across the kitchen and put her arms around me. Not brief this time, the held kind, the kind that says, "I'm not ready to let go yet," and I was not ready to let go either, so we simply stayed that way for a while in the kitchen of my apartment, while the July evening did whatever it was doing outside and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said or known or understood between us. Eventually, she pulled back and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture I recognized with a shock of recognition because it was exactly what I used to do, exactly the gesture, and I had not known until that moment that she had it too. I opened the velvet pouch and took out the necklace. The 3 interlocking diamonds caught the kitchen light the way they always did, the way that had seemed almost alive to me ever since Richard put it in my hands 30 years ago. "Turn around," I said. She did. I clasped the necklace around her neck. I smoothed the chain at the back with my fingers. She turned to face me. The pendant sat at the base of her throat, exactly where it was supposed to be, in the way that the right things have of finding their right places. "Perfect," I said. And I meant it. Not in the word's decorative sense, the easy adjective of approval, but in its actual meaning: complete, finished. The thing that has reached where it was always supposed to be. There is something I want to say to you, directly, before this story ends. Something that isn't about me or Nathan or Clara or a boardroom in Chicago on a November morning. I want to say it to the person who has been listening, whoever you are, wherever you are watching from. Because I have spent this whole story inside my own experience, which is the only place I have access to. And before I leave it, I want to say the thing that I have been circling throughout without quite landing on. Nobody gets to tell you that you're finished. Nobody gets to decide that your age, your circumstances, your history of losses, your unfashionable face, or your older body, or your outdated references, or your slower pace. None of those things give another person the authority to declare you done, to write you out of your own story, to look at you and calculate that you are manageable. You are not manageable, not by anyone who hasn't earned the right to ask for your trust, and possibly not even then. The people who looked at me and saw diminishment were not stupid. They were, in their way, paying attention. They had noticed real things, the ways that 72 is different from 45, the genuine adjustments that time requires, the real vulnerabilities that come with any human life lived long enough. And they had taken that real information and turned it into a weapon. This is what certain kinds of people do. They find the true thing, the real limitation, the genuine worry, the actual need, and they use it to build a story about you that serves their purposes. And the cruelest part of it is that they often have your cooperation because the story they're building has just enough truth in it that you doubt yourself before you doubt them. Don't cooperate with people who use your truth against you. Don't sign the papers without reading them. Don't let someone else manage your relationships without understanding why. Don't let the pace of a visit and the warmth of a familiar face override the instinct that says something here is wrong. And if you're sitting somewhere right now watching this, and you are not old, if you're 25 or 35 or 45, and this feels like a story about someone else's life, please hear this too. The people in your life who are older than you are not waiting to become burdens. They are not problems that have not yet fully presented themselves. They are people who have information you don't have yet, who have survived things you haven't had to survive yet, who are still in the middle of their lives even when the culture around them insists those lives are winding down. Look at them. Actually look. Not at what you assume they need, not at what it would be convenient for them to be, but at who they actually are. I was a 72-year-old woman standing on a wet sidewalk in October holding a necklace I'd intended to give my granddaughter. And I was also the person who had built the institution my son was trying to steal. Both of those things were true simultaneously. Both of those things will always be true. The woman they dismissed as an old grandmother was the same woman who walked into that boardroom and took back everything they had tried to take from her. Not because she was extraordinary. I want to be careful about that word, because extraordinary is how we excuse ourselves from applying a lesson to our own lives. Because she refused in the end to be anything other than exactly who she was. That is available to you. It is available to anyone who has the clarity and the courage to insist on it. It was available to me. And standing in my kitchen in July, watching my granddaughter touch the necklace at her throat with one careful finger, I understood, not for the first time, but more completely than before, that this was what the 40 years had been for. Not the company, not the money, not the legal victory. This. The continuity of something real, passed from one pair of hands to another, by people who understood what it was made of. I washed the rest of the dishes. Lillian dried. The summer evening settled around the apartment. Outside, the city continued being the city. Indifferent, enormous, full of its own thousand stories running simultaneously, none of them aware of any of the others. Somewhere out there, Nathan was in his rented apartment figuring out who he was. Somewhere, Clara was in a conversation with her attorney about how to survive what was coming. Somewhere, Renata was probably working late, because that was who she was. Gerald was probably doing a crossword. Patricia was probably asleep by now. She'd mentioned she'd been sleeping well lately, better than she had in years. And I was here, in my kitchen, with my granddaughter, still standing. That was enough. It turned out, more than enough. It was everything.